Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys in a Stack of Comics. Mike, Wednesdays, we've been diving through X-Men history. We kind of did
I
one video
know.
on the 60s and then one video that kind of talked about their cancellation and then how much giant size X-Men changed the game. The initial plan was for us to kind of do one video that bridged giant size through the 80s. It's not going to happen. We're going to have to take quite a few
You
videos in that.
can't.
The
Yeah.
80s is where X-Men becomes X-Men, where X-Men becomes one of the most dominant comic books on the market, and Chris Claremont is the driving force behind the majority of that. So what we thought today will bridge a little bit of what happens between Giant Size X-Men and then where Claremont takes over. And then the next couple of weeks, we're just going to spend time talking about some of Claremont's greatest stories, what it did for X-Men, why it's unique in the comic book world to do what it did. Mike, one of the interesting things with this, when you say Wolverine is a character, everyone knows, Hulk's where he debuts, Giant Size X-Men's his introduction to the X-Men. And then from there, everyone kind of looks and goes, Claremont's the man who redefined Wolverine. And with that miniseries, he did. The interesting part is comic books is sometimes just accidents, that decisions that people make. And one of the interesting things is after Giant Size X-Men, the mutant who eventually takes over the book, he was massively overshadowed. And Claremont, who wrote the miniseries that changed him, was actually pushing for him to be gone. He thought about removing him. It's John Byrne, who is Canadian, who ends up fighting for Wolverine to stay because he
Yeah.
just wanted a Canadian superhero on the team. How crazy is it to you, Mike, that that's where we are with this? That like, as a Wolverine fan, that hit me so weird when I heard that and like researching it more. That like Logan was almost gone, didn't
Well,
work. I mean, crazy.
well, Chris wanted to be a writer, I believe, and he didn't really want to get into comics, but he started interning in Marvel as a college job and was able to write a few things, and they liked him and they kept him on, and then they kept giving him more, right? Because he's so good.
Mhm.
He found his calling kind of inadvertently in comics, which probably hadn't happened in a long time because this generation of creators that came up in the 70s were initially fans of comics that used it, that were really trying to make that comics their career, which was opposite of what happened in the 30s and 40s. People who got into comics used it as a way station to getting into illustration for magazines or, writing novels and paperbacks and short stories. Like Stan Lee, he always wanted to be a novelist. So this generation is weird. And then here comes Chris, who's like, he never really was a big comic book fan, but he inadvertently gets into comics and it starts paying the bills. And thank goodness for us, because he wrote some great stories. And
Mhm.
John Byrne, his buddy that he wrote all the classic X-Men stories, kind of helped guide him through some of these things. In fact, he was the one who suggested the plot to Chris for Days of Future Past. And a lot of people don't know that. But he's also here, coming to the rescue of Wolverine as well. So this creative team of Byrne and Claremont is just really can't be overstated. They were amazing
Yeah, we
together.
always hear a ton about Claremont. It's really when you research a lot of people think Byrne was co-plotting a lot of these characters.
Yeah,
His name doesn't get quite the recognition. What's interesting with Claremont, we'll get into some of the stories here, but one of his first issues, I think he takes over at 94 officially. Um, Basically, this team would get introduced in Giant Size X-Men, and then they go rescue the original bunch. All the original team leaves, with the exception of Cyclops. Like he
right.
very early on kind of formats that team that way, which is aggressive move for your
Yeah,
first, sort of issue. You get his second issue, I think, in 95, issue 95. He then goes ahead and kills one of the characters in John Proudstar, Thunderbird, in that as well. I think what's so interesting with Claremont, like you said, what makes him an interesting writer of comics is early on he took some major swings that you and I talked in the last video about Giant Size X Men. The willingness to have Cyclops be the leader of the team is kind of the bridge of, hey, if you were an older X Men fan, we haven't forgotten you. We're still remembering your guys. We're going to go save them. He keeps that in there. Cyclops, in a certain way, because of Claremont's ability to know, I need an original member. He kind of becomes the living legacy. Cyclops is the leftover, the holdover of the original team. But so
Yeah.
much is Claremont taking chances. And I think this is where me and you talk about comic books and why X-Men becomes great. X-Men took a lot of risks. X-Men was willing to kill characters off, have characters leave the book, and do things like that. I think that's what's missing out of comics now. How much do you think Claremont's willingness to kind of take these major swings carried his run and what happens in all these stories we're going to go through?
I think it's indicative of the fact that, he wasn't originally a comic book fan and the fact that he was a talented writer, putting his skills into this medium. I think a creator like Chris was willing to take those kind of risks because he had a mind for creative writing just in general and not specifically with comic books. So when he was given the reins to the X-Men title after Len Wein, I think you could tell he dove into it, and really was willing to take those risks where maybe somebody else wouldn't quite have done that. And it paid off in a big, big way. The audience at the time of the late 70s, early 80s was starving for stuff like this, and Chris Claremont delivered.
So the comic takes off. It goes from being a title that was canceled and basically in reprints to one issue puts it back on the map to when Claremont starts going, this thing explodes to become almost the most dominant comic book on the stands. And in all honesty, we're going to spend a couple videos breaking down some of these stories. But the crazy thing with which X-Men, the 80s, basically all the stories that we have seen adapted, all the ones that have turned into the movies, all the ones when you think X-Men great stories, as much as the 90s, because of the cartoon, kind of crystallized the X-Men as this great team, the 80s is where it's at. This is where all of it kind of coalesces together. And in all honesty, not to say anything negative about the amazing the creators that have been there. It is insane how Claremont has nothing to do with their creation, has nothing to do with the comic book that ends up saving them with Giant Size X-Men, but he becomes the guy who is like the definitive who's the X-Men guy. It's
Yeah.
him. Mike, can you think of any other creative person like this where 20, 30 years in, he becomes the de facto definitive creator? The closest I can think is, I mean, maybe Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil on Batman, and that
Yeah.
kind of became the definitive him. But how unique do you think it is, Claremont's kind of rise of 20 something years in? This guy takes it and then it just blows up because we don't really see that with Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or any other group, really. He's kind of unique in that regard.
Yeah, by the time John Romita Sr. took over Spider-Man, he was already huge. But you point out Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, they really took Batman to a whole nother level and brought the comic books industry with them. So your analogy is spot on. That really doesn't happen again until you get Chris Claremont and John Byrne, another creative giant of a team, to take on X-Men and just catapult comics into the 80s and into the 90s and then even into the 2000s because all the material from the early movies was taken from
It's
Claremont and
it's all Claremont, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you just gotta know the animated series, everything.
It's all adapting plots from from him. We're gonna do these a little out of order, but the one I want to make sure we get to today, I know it's later down the line, but your favorite X-Men story is, I believe, Days of Future Past. And that's
Yes.
when I know with us starting Claremont, it's a little out of order and we got Dark Phoenix and stuff we'll cover on this, but I know that's one of your all-time favorites. Why, for you, why does that story resonate as much as it does as like the definitive Claremont
Well,
one that you
for
feel?
me being a Flash fan, it has a little bit of that sci-fi time traveling twist to it, which I really, really liked. And you know, when we started talking about X-Men several months ago, I started thinking like, I didn't really like what's coming out, but I was encouraging our readers to go back and read some of the old stuff. And these reprints just came out recently, and they're still running. These are all Claremont reprints. They're on on your comic book shelf every month. And last year they did this story again, and just rereading it just made me relive how much I love this story. Um, so it's a two-issue story arc officially, but really, if you read the couple before 139 and 140, you really get a little more meat to the story. So I would say these four issues uh, um, are a great sampling of Days of Future Past, and I'm sure there's trade paperbacks, but I really love the coming of age of the character Kitty Pryde,
Hmm.
who she's just this teenage kid who that Xavier takes under his wing, and by the end, because it's a travel in time, you get to see her character really grow up by the last issue, and now this kid who seems almost useless in the
Hmm.
first couple of issues really comes to her own into her own and saves the day by the end of the issue. So you get to see this arc of the character coming into her own, and it's just really, really well done. The threat of the Sentinels and all the stuff that's going on, the dystopia kind of. I'm a big Blade Runner fan, so I love the dystopian theme in there and how they have to save the future. But then the poignant way it ends when they all come back, and the fact that Kitty's helpless, right? She's kind of like in and out of consciousness as they're fighting this massive battle in the future. And it's just, I mean, in the past, and she's kind of helpless in the future, right? They're kind of carrying her from place to place. And it's just so poignant at the end when she convinces the X-Men of the present, 1980, to embark on this mission and save the future world, at the end, like the cast of characters, the X-Men don't know if it really worked or not. They're like,
I don't know. Did we stop it or is it delayed or?
yeah. And I just think that is such a great way to end that story. Such a quintessential X-Men story, in my opinion.
Well, I think things again. I think it's Byrne on the pencils on that, and then he co-plots a lot of it with Claremont's help. And again, this is where John Byrne is kind of the underappreciated man of this, and that we attribute so much to Claremont, and granted, deserves a ton. I think one of the coolest things that when I reread Days of Future Past that stands out to me, two issues. We associate grand storytelling and sweeping story arcs now with 12-issue maxi series and year-long story arcs and stuff like that. That in basically the span of about 50 pages, he tells something that has had the impact that it's had, and it's been a movie adaptation. How many times have we seen the cartoons of this? Adapt this kind of plot. Largely, I think it was a TV show, Wolverine and the X-Men, that largely kind of lifted from this same thing of the future dystopia and like how do they prevent it kind of thing. How prevalent this sort of story becomes in X-Men later, where you have all these alternate time, and it's weird in that when I read it, because I reread it, and it's something I've read before, but when you pick it back up, you realize like some of the grainy details that your brain sort of casually associates with it when you haven't actually gone back and read it. What is so interesting to me is how much the time travel, different timelines thing kind of all branches out of this. And what's funny is, as an X-Men fan, I've really detested the alternate timeline stuff in the last couple of years because it's gotten so convoluted and there's so many different characters. But this is where it starts, and you forget how well executed it used to be. And
Yeah,
that's the sad thing is some of these plots that Byrne and Claremont and these legends came up with, sadly, much like Watchmen with Alan Moore, the dark turn that the comics take stinks now because you look and go, man, but it's only bad because they're not as good as he was. And I think that's the thing with Claremont and Byrne with Days of Future Past is you're like, man, that storytelling technique is really, really effective when done
yeah,
incredibly well. We've just seen it, unfortunately, kind of parodied almost at this point with so many storylines that have done the same thing. But I think the other part too, Kitty Pryde is the narrative character that carries the story is kind of crazy. And this is where X-Men again is such a unique brand in that to have such a classic story, and it's not Wolverine really. He's a part, but not huge. It's not Cyclops. It's not Jean. It's not Beast. It's none of the usual suspects that
The
carry that
heavy
story.
hitters.
It's really a second tier, third tier character who
Was
carries
brand
probably
new.
one of the most iconic stories of the whole X-Men brand. It's crazy how well that was integrated.
I know. I loved it because, she was brand new and and like I said, you see the whole arc. You see her as her older self, and then you see her in the present acting as her older self, but in this youngster form. And the leap of faith that the team has to take with her just really underscores the team nature of the book. Like, here's this newbie to the team, but they have such trust and faith in one another. They're ready to take a leap of faith and go with her on this what seems like a wild goose chase, to save the world when they didn't know it needed to be saved at that
Yeah.
moment in time.
No, when you said you wanted to start with Days of Future Past, like man, we're gonna skip past a couple of these stories, but I think where it is a good place to start with examining Claremont in his era. This is his strength. This is ultimately what makes him the writer that he is that, and it's what makes X-Men what X-Men is. You have 10 to 12 characters who can carry a story, and as a fan, you don't really mind. At no point when I was reading Days of Future Past was I like, man, this sucks. Where's Storm and Nightcrawler and Wolverine? Why aren't they care? You're totally invested, despite the fact that Kitty. I think if I listed my 10 favorite X-Men characters, she's not in that group. But you read that story and you're like, man, that was really good. And
Yeah.
that is what they used to do so well. And again, it's one of those things where this is everything wrong now with comics. And that now they're so like wanting to recreate the third tier character who's the main focus. You
Yeah.
can do that, but you got to be Byrne, you got to be Claremont, and you got to be the guys who can do it at that level. And sadly, we don't have that as much now. It's just really impressive when you go back and see it, and that this is what makes this comic unique and unlike anything else on the market. Really is the depth of the characters and what you can explore. And like you said, the story arc of new character, relative newbie, doesn't know what she's doing, fish out of water, all those kind of things, and it coalesces into this iconic story that fits so well. We'll talk a little more Days of Future Past. I think one of the things, Mike, we have the whole mutants and internment camps and things like that pop up in this story, which is huge, recurring sort of thing. Again, this is one of those things where I think X-Men and realism kind of fit together. But again, you can do the obvious easy parallel of internment camps and things like that and go to the World War II piece of things. That's the most easy correlation that you can kind of get to it. But I love again X-Men. It's on the nose, but it's not. And this is where I think X-Men has always been so good back then is you could take that storyline and multiple different groups of people throughout history could read that and go, oh, that's a stand in for what we went through. As opposed to, I feel like in 2020, we would have to make it like deliberately like, no, it only represents this type of person. And I think that's the brilliance that X-Men always explored was these timeless themes, the struggle of the outsider, that kind of stuff, but where it could translate to different readers of different generations. The timeless nature of the plots is what's always so impressive when you go back and read these.
Yeah, when you think it was written probably in 79 or 80, it was published in 1980, I think. So, what was on their mind. And of course, Claremont is Jewish. So, you know, and that was the year that Blade Runner came out. I think,
Mhm.
was it 80 or 82 that Blade Runner came out?
I think Blade Runner's 82. Days of Future Past, I believe, came out across 80 and 81. I think it ends in January of
But there,
81.
as we inched towards 1984, um,
Mhm.
the fiction was, heavily invested in this dystopian future that George Orwell predicted, and of course, Philip K. Dick also.
Mhm.
who wrote a lot of dystopian science fiction. And so this was right on the nose for the time. So you could, and it was that point in time where you could either think, well, this is dystopian, or we could relate it to, the politics of war and peace of the past, and just general human nature, which is often what Philip K. Dick wrote about, the eventuality of whatever technology that we're going to have.
Hmm.
Human nature is always going to be its primitive self and rear its ugly head. And so here, Chris Claremont takes us into the world of 2023. And I think Marvel actually put it in the 819 universe or whatever,
811, I think. Yeah. It's
811,
crazy
something like
reading
that.
it, and I think yeah, it's 2013 is the dystopian. Like,
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
want to feel old, be like, oh, that was 12 years ago. Um,
Yeah. So, but yeah, but he really takes us there for a moment to see the ugliness of humanity in the future when the Sentinels and everything runs amok. But brilliantly done. And like I always say, if you're an X-Men fan, worry not. You can always dive back, a couple of decades and get great comic books, great stories with all your favorite characters, and some new ones, and maybe ones that you didn't think of. And they were all done very, very well, treated respectfully, great story arcs, great writing, great art. It's all there for you if you're in an X-Men kind of rut right now.
yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the most fun things of this with you and me. We talked about wanting to go back and revisit X-Men and rereading this as we kind of cover them and stuff. It just reminds you how good these used to be and how some of these stories kind of like they live in your head a little bit, and then you go back and you read it and you realize how easy it is to get reinvested in these, and how like just how on point the writing is and how much you care about so many characters. And I think that's the enduring legacy of Claremont. And we're gonna cover Dark Phoenix next and a couple different stories as we go. But one of the things that's so impressive is his ability. Again, I still can't get over 2 issues. How much that plot spawns so much X-Men media. I mean, how many times have we seen that cover of the Wolverine in front of the thing with all the map, the list of all the other mutants? That cover has been parodied and repurposed by almost every comic book at this point. And you'd think it's, oh, that had to be from some decade long culminate. No, 2 issues. Like someone walked in and just picked up issue 140 of X-Men, and this is what they got. It's like that is crazy that it happens in that short of a span, but or 141 and 142. It's crazy that someone that's just how comics used to be, whereas now it kind of lacks that. But let us know your thoughts down below, folks. We're going to cover Claremont's X-Men here for probably the next couple of weeks. Next week, we'll dive into Dark Phoenix Saga, talk about that's impact, that's enduring legacy, both positive and negative, and that there's some things that happen in and out of that story that both were good and bad for X-Men in the future. But let us know your thoughts down below on John Byrne and Chris Claremont's initial contributions to X-Men, and what is your favorite Claremont story. As always, folks, thank you for watching. God bless you. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks, everybody.